The debates on the origins of life are many, spanning many cultures over many centuries. So also are discussions on the evolution of man, the impacts of extraterrestrial activity on humans, and even how viruses originated. Do we have final answers for any of these? I'm not so sure. But the relatively new science of astrobiology may be able to shed some light on these complex, multi-dimensional debates. A pioneer in astrobiology, Vidyajyoti Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe is a Sri Lankan British astronomer who, together with the preeminent astronomer of the 20th century, the late Sir Fred Hoyle, was a proponent of the new theory of cometary panspermia, a theory that is fast gaining acceptance at the present time. Chandra has a distinguished academic record, a prize winner at Royal College Colombo, a first-class honours graduate in mathematics from the University of Ceylon, a Commonwealth Scholar from Trinity College, Cambridge, a Fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge, are just a few of his various accolades. He was awarded the highest doctorate in science from the University of Cambridge and holds numerous honorary doctorates from universities in Sri Lanka and Japan. To date, he has authored over 500 technical papers and over 30 books, which include Diseases from Outer Space, Cosmic Genetic Evolution, The Search for Our Cosmic Ancestry, Where Did We Come From?, Our Cosmic Ancestry in the Stars. His lifelong collaboration with Sir Fred is documented in the book with the title A Journey with Fred Hoyle. An honorary professor at the University of Buckingham and the University of Ruhuna, Sri Lanka, and an adjunct professor at the National Institute of Fundamental Studies, Sri Lanka, he was formerly professor at University College Cardiff and Cardiff University. And Professor Wickramasinghe, born in Colombo, comes from a family of 4 siblings who are all unusually in the sciences. Welcome, Professor Wickramasinghe. Just talking about your life in Sri Lanka. You were born in Sri Lanka, you spent your entire childhood and adolescent years in Sri Lanka. Tell me a little bit about your early life and how did your Sri Lankan connection shape your career in later years?
Yes, I can try to do that. Well, I was born in 1939 to a crown colony of the British Empire, which was Ceylon at the time. And it was a time of great certainty, I recall, right from my very early years. Everything was so stable, peaceful, and the part of the city that I lived in, which was called Bambalapitiya, was literally a suburb of the capital. We had open fields in front of our house and narrow lanes with sort of mud ruts. If you're going to drive over them, it was very bumpy ride. And so I used to walk every evening across these little bumpy roads, cross Gaul Road, which was then still a major road, but nothing like the huge sort of dual carriageways that we have today, and then cross over to walk to the beach. And there was a railway line, and I spent hours in the evenings watching the sunset. This is my sort of recollection of my childhood from the age of about maybe 12, 13 or something. I used to do that regularly. The other abiding memory I have, which I sort of really regret to even recall, was that at a very early age, me and my brother went to school in a rickshaw, pulled by a poor, hapless guy. I think he was barefoot, and he was carrying this cart, big wheels and so on. And at that time, I didn't think anything of it. But when I now think of what I was doing, I really feel that it was a relic of empire. And during the empire, I think there were many things that we don't want to even remember, and this was one of them. So it was a very hierarchical society, and I was born to a family that was sort of rather elite, intellectual. My father was a very distinguished mathematical scholar in Cambridge. He was in the 1930s. He went to Trinity College, Cambridge. He trained under an iconic astronomer called Sir Arthur Eddington. And I've got letters written by Eddington saying my father was a brilliant student and so on. So he got all these very high honors in the mathematical tripos, prizes and so on. but he couldn't get an academic job. His ambition was to sort of become a lecturer or a professor, and there were just no openings in Ceylon at the time. So he ended up taking an exam called the Indian Civil Service Examination, which was something that sort of all the very clever English people aspired to get into. And he got into that with very high honors. And so he spent about 2 years in Bihar as a collector of customs in the 1930s, and then returned to Ceylon, where I was born, and so on. So that was my very early life. But then I went to school at Royal College, Colombo. And in those days, it was a school that was modeled on the English public school system. Eton and Harrow and so on were the models. And I had a really marvelous time there socially and educationally. I thought it was a great school. I enjoyed my lessons in Greek and Latin. I studied Greek and Latin for a while. And I was steeped in English literature as well. And so this was, to me, the sort of broad base that I had. But my passion was for mathematics and science. And by the age of 13 or 14, I told my father, I want to be an astronomer. And I'll tell you the reason that I decided that. We used to go to the hill country on holidays, and we had occasions to see the night sky under very, very clean conditions where there's no pollution. And so day after day, night after night on those holidays, I would see the Milky Way stretching across the sky. And then I literally spent hours sort of staring at this and saying to myself that one day I'm going to try to find out about these. So that was my early encounter in sort of astronomical thinking. And then when I talked to my father, he said, well, the first thing you need to do is to have a sound grounding in mathematics and physics. So that's what I did. I sort of essentially diverted my interest from the classics and literature to the sciences. Which wasn't easy because I was really passionately interested in the literary side of things. So I did that, and then I got very high marks and so on. And when I told my father that I want to be an astronomer, he said, "Well, that's a very virtuous and noble thing to do, but you would end up with no job at the end of it." Right? So that's where I stood in my teens. But I decided that I was determined to try to pursue a course that led me to astronomy.
So in 1960, you arrived in Cambridge.
Yes.
And into the University of Cambridge. And that was actually the start of that long collaboration you had with the legendary astronomer of the last century, Sir Fred Hoyle. Now, tell me a little bit about this encounter and how it actually developed over the 15 years or so while you remained there in Cambridge.
Yeah, well, I had read about Fred Hoyle even in my sort of A-level, advanced level years. I had bought a book called Frontiers of Astronomy by Fred Hoyle and read it and so on. So I was sort of primed in the kind of writings that he had written. He also wrote a novel called The Black Cloud, which in which there was an intelligent cloud of dust and so on. So I had some background knowledge of him. So when I arrived in Cambridge on this Commonwealth scholarship, and with great trepidation I walked into his house because he used to see all his students in his residence rather than his office. And it was a totally disarming experience because he was a very warm, welcoming person. He had a wife who was also even more welcoming and disarming. So within a few minutes of my visit there, I was exchanging thoughts about life and poetry and so on. And so we got on very well together. And then as the science part of it started, our discussion started, he decided to put me onto a problem that was unsolved for a long time about the sun. The sun is a star, of course, right? And we know a lot more about the sun than about any other star. And there were great mysteries in the 1960s about the sun's magnetic field. Sun is magnetic, like a sort of like a bar magnet, and that field reverses every 11 years or so. And the question is, why does it reverse? How does it reverse? So I set out to try to unravel that mystery, and within about less than a year, I thought I unraveled it. We wrote a paper that was published in a journal and acclaimed and so on. But having finished that project, I went back to Fred Hoyle and said, this is not a very exciting area of research for me. What else is there that is unsolved in astronomy? And then he thought for a while, and he said that there is a very long-standing problem that is still virtually unanswered, and this is the question of what the cosmic dust is made of. And I told you about the night sky that I saw in my childhood in Sri Lanka, and you see the Milky Way sort of stretching across the horizon. In between the stars, one sees huge clouds, dark clouds of various shapes, like elephants' trunks and coal, sacks of coal and so on. And this had been known for a long time. So the question is, what are these dark patches made of? And the answer that astronomers had in the 1960s was that these were trillions and trillions of microscopic ice particles, right? Tiny, tiny ice particles, like the ice particles that are present in the cumulus clouds of the Earth's atmosphere. If you look at the sky now, you see these clouds, and those white clouds are essentially tiny microscopic ice particles. So the idea was that in between the stars, there were huge, massive quantities of these ice particles. So that was the conventional wisdom for maybe 20 or 30 years. And I was asked to try to re-examine that. And this was a very exciting project for me, and within 6 months, I came to the conclusion that the old idea of ice grains was just absolute rubbish. It didn't make any sense in relation to what we knew about the astronomy of these clouds, and instead, the dust clouds were made mainly of a chemical element called carbon. All right, the carbon that is in our bodies, the carbon in soot, in coal, and just charcoal, and so on. So that was the main composition of this dust, as far as I could see, in 1962. So we published a paper on this. We had an extensive paper that I wrote based on calculations, and it was, of course, criticized by some, but acclaimed by most as a major breakthrough in our understanding of cosmic dust. So that was 1962, but I didn't rest there. I want to find out, why should there be so much carbon in the form of microscopic particles all over the universe, right? So there were more astronomy happening, more telescopes, more techniques that were probing this dust from the 1960s onwards. And so my occupation through the next 4 or 5 years was to follow this story, the observational story of the exploration of this dust. And by 1974, I was absolutely convinced that the carbon was not just like soot particles, but they were organic molecules in a solid form, right? This was a major revelation to me, and a really revolution in astronomical and scientific thinking. The paper was published in Nature. It was acclaimed by some, but violently criticized by others as being absolutely impossible. How can somebody who's a very famous person published a rebuttal saying, how can organic molecules, right? Organic molecules, they thought were very fragile. How can they exist and persist in the very harsh conditions of space, right? And we had answers to all those, of course, but this was the prejudice that came to be exposed right from the beginning. But it didn't deter me, and it didn't deter my collaborators to take the story further, to do more and more research and so on. And by the early 80s, by 1982, we had suggested that these dust particles are not just organic, but they may be living, freeze-dried living microorganisms, bacteria and viruses. And that was a shocker because no one liked to hear that. But we made a prediction that if this was true, if this dust that you see all over the sky was really made up to significant extent with these dust particles, with these bacteria particles, viruses and bacteria, then there are certain predictions that you can make, right? You can make some very, very sharp predictions and then begin to look for evidence for that, for verifications of those predictions. So that was what we did in 1982. We had a very definite prediction, a signature that we said should exist if this was true. And we told astronomers, you better turn your telescopes to the most distant source of what's called infrared light in the galaxy, and test our prediction. And this was in the early 1980s, and no one was willing to even dare do that because they thought this was such a crazy proposition. There was no organic dust, there was certainly not going to be any bacterial dust. But fortunately for me, I had a younger brother who was quite a bit younger than me, who had become professor of astronomy at the Australian National University in Canberra. He's a mathematician himself. And so we engaged his interest in this matter, and he had access to the powerful telescopes, the Anglo-Australian telescope in Australia. And he made the test, the observation, the astronomical observation. And when he sent the result, and he didn't know what to expect. I mean, we didn't tell him what he should find there. When he sent the result to us by fax, it was in those days there weren't cell phones, there weren't smartphones and so on. So it was a machine that was rather cumbersome, but you could send a picture, you can send a document. So when we saw this, it matched 100%, agreed with the prediction of a bacterium in space. So that was it. I think we decided, Fred Hoyle and I at that time decided that you make a prediction, and if that prediction is verified to that degree of precision, we have to be on the right track. So we made up our mind, I made up my mind that I'm going to take this further and explore more of the consequences of the cosmic dust being living entities. So that was how the research started and progressed into the early 1980s.
So in 1973, Professor, you left Cambridge and went into Cardiff as the youngest ever professor at that time at 34. How did your theories progress there? What was it like?
Yeah, I had the opportunity then because I was head of a small department and I was able to take graduate students, research students, and encourage some young staff to do things that interested me. So I had the resources to do little more than I would do as I was able to do in Cambridge as a fellow of a college. So we set up a small group in Cardiff. We had a research student, a very competent, practical guy from Iraq, who I took as a PhD student. And so he was engaged in doing laboratory spectra of bacteria and viruses under conditions of space. Right? So we were doing all that, and we found that the correspondence between the theory of life being everywhere, bacteria being everywhere, and the science in the laboratory was getting stronger by the day. That was what was happening, and over a period of 2 or 3 years, I think I became more and more engaged with this project and more convinced that there was no other answer to the problem of the cosmic dust and they being living entities and living particles. And of course, I mean, if you look at the Earth today, you see organic, I mean, all of this stuff here is organic, right? And if you take a lump of soil outside, there's a huge amount of organic material, right? And you don't question, you don't ask how that organic material is there. They can, it is there because there is life, right? Bacteria, the dead bodies of bacteria, the dead bodies of living entities, and that's the source of all the 99.999% of all the organic molecules that you see on the Earth is generated from biology. So when we find in deep space that 99% of the dust is of that kind of material, organic material, complex organic molecules, why have a different set of rules? Why not at least as a first guess, think that this is due to the living process? And that was a big stumbling block for Western science, even up to the present time. But in the 1980s, there was a cultural obstacle that we had to overcome. But nevertheless, we were brave enough to get resources enough to continue our work, and that's what we did.
Now, you are recognized as the father of panspermia. Tell me a little bit, what is panspermia and what is the history that it has from ancient to modern times?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it is an ancient theory, and the theory panspermia means pans is sort of everywhere. Spermia is from the Greek word spermata, meaning seeds. So panspermia really stands for seeds everywhere. And this was an idea that was articulated by a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher called Anaxagoras, right? And he lived in the sort of 5th century, and he was a very free thinker, revolutionary ideas he had about the sun, about the stars and so on. So that was a great ancient Greek idea. But the contradicting concept was also a Greek concept, and that was due to Aristotle, a philosopher that came 200 years later than Anaxagoras. And he is Aristotle. The Aristotelian philosophy is very famous and lasted for a very long time. So he was a much more influential figure in Western philosophy than Anaxagoras. So Anaxagoras was sort of sidelined and forgotten about, and the Aristotelian philosophy was diagonally opposed to Anaxagoras. Aristotle said that life emerges spontaneously from non-living matter whenever the conditions are appropriate. For example, he said that fireflies emerge from a mixture of warm earth and morning dew, because in the morning, in the evening, you see fireflies coming, and he said this is a mixture of warm earth and morning dew. And that was just an example of the kind of analogies that got really stuck in people's thinking, that this was a very easy transformation. The transformation from non-life to life was reckoned to be really straightforward, really easy, and achieved under very simple conditions. So that was Aristotle. So these were two opposite points of view. Now the panspermia point of view was, as I said, in the European, in the Greco-Roman tradition, goes back to 500 BC, but in ancient Egypt, in the Indus Valley civilization, in Vedic traditions, it goes back much, much further than that. So the idea of life being a truly cosmic attribute is deeply rooted in Indian philosophy. It's in Egyptian philosophy as well, and possibly in Babylonian philosophy. So it has a very ancient roots. And the fact that Aristotle was, in the history of European thinking, was more influential than these earlier guys, really set the scene for what followed for the next nearly 2,000 years. And one example, of course, of that kind of Earth-centered view was the idea that the Earth itself was at the center of the universe, which is an Aristotelian view, and it stood in the way of progress for nearly 200 or 300 years. It stood in the way of scientific astronomical progress, and the Copernican revolution, we all know, was a very important milestone in the whole development of modern science, and that had to fight the Aristotelian Earth-centered point of view as far as the physical placement of the Earth and planets is concerned. But the centrality of life as an entity that was easily produced sort of continued. Aristotle continued almost unto modern times, almost to the days that we were beginning to probe the cosmic dust.
Professor Wickramasinghe, you've written extensively about comets. Tell me a little bit about your theories about, comets and their relativity to the origins of life.
Yeah, that's again an interesting question, because comets have been really both revered and feared by many ancient cultures. The ancient Egyptians, the Chinese, the Indians, and so on, and even the early Europeans, they looked at comets with a sense of trepidation and awe. Why should this be so? The modern answer is that these guys were ignorant, that our ancient ancestors were basically stupid. And so what's taken as for granted now is that these ideas are primitive superstitions, and we don't want to delve into them anymore. But what happened in the 1980s, when we were finding evidence for microbial life or bacterial life in space, was that there was a question as to where that bacterial life is stored over long periods of time, right? And comets were the obvious candidate that we came upon when we thought of what could store bacteria, viruses, particularly bacteria, for billions upon billions of years in a viable condition. Then these comets came to the fore, because comets are most of the time deep frozen entities. They're lumps of organic ices, rocks, and so on, that are at very low sub-zero temperatures. There are something like 100 billion of these comets around our planetary system, right? There's a whole halo of comets that surround the entire planetary system. And from time to time, these comets are deflected into the inner parts of our solar system, comes close to the Earth. And when they come close to the Earth and close to the Sun, you get this huge stream of the cometary tails, the spectacular tails of comets. Sometimes these tails intersect, cross the Earth's orbit, enter the Earth's environment, and whatever is coming out of the comet then can enter the Earth, right? And so if comets are the repositories of cosmic life, then these comet tails could be the dispensers of cosmic life onto the surface of planets. So that is the idea that we began to explore in the early 1980s. And at this stage, comets were not studied except from the ground, from telescopes, but the opportunity began to arise for comets to be studied from space. This was the beginning of the space age. So what was possible in 1986 was to send a spacecraft almost flying past the center of the comet, the core of the comet. So this was done, and in 1986, in the middle of 1986, the European spacecraft there was a space mission called Giotto. There was a spacecraft that came very close to the comet and set out to take pictures of the comet's core. If there was a solid object there, then they thought they better get pictures of it. And the expectation was that this was just a lump of ice, right? dirty lump of dirty ice. And what do you do when you want to photograph a field of ice? You take your cameras and you turn down the shutter to the smallest aperture, right? And these are all cameras, not the modern smartphone cameras, right? So you had to really make your aperture small in order to get a picture that way you didn't overexpose the plate. So that's what they did. They shut the apertures expecting a bright snowfield. Now, we had expected a different picture because we saw the comets were organic and black and so on. So we published letters to the London Times saying, watch it. Yeah, they're not going to find anything in those pictures. And sure enough, everybody's watching their television screens, and the spacecraft flew past the comet, and the commentators, the newsreaders say, oh, we have lost the comet. Maybe there's nothing there. We can't see anything, right? And the reason was that the comet was black. It is black as pitch. So they had to do a lot of image processing after the event to recover a picture of a coal black comet. So this was the first big triumph for us in terms of the connection of comets and carbonaceous material and comets and life. Okay. So another development that followed from the Comet Halley encounter in 1986 was involved my brother again. So it sounds almost like nepotism, but my brother died in Australia, and a colleague, David Allen, made the first observation of the tail of this comet, and they found the spectrum, as it's called, of the tail matched the spectrum of a bacterium to an uncanny degree of precision. Right? So this was published in Nature, and everyone said this is just a coincidence. It doesn't really need to mean anything very much. But over the years, this coincidence has been repeated time and time again. The tail of the comet and the stuff that comes out of the comet matches living entities, living particles like bacteria to an amazing degree of precision. So that was 1986, and since then, comets have been examined with great force and with great enthusiasm by the European Space Agency, by NASA, and so on. Every single attempt to study comets have shown consistency with a living comet. And the most recent two encounters, space encounters, was the so-called Rosetta mission to Comet 67 PCG, as it's called. There's two double-barreled Russian names, right? And so every bit of information that came from this Rosetta mission is again consistent with the comet's surface being organic, completely matching the spectrum of a bacterium or living entities, and that has continued. And recently, about 2 years ago, there was a comet called Comet Lovejoy that was studied by French astronomers. And they found that comet was throwing out a stream of sugar in the tail and ethyl alcohol, right? And how on earth is this being produced? A sugar plus alcohol. It is undoubtedly, in my mind, the products of fermentation. Bacteria fermenting underneath the surface of the frozen comet. So that's the 2016, 17. And 2022, there have been observations, studies, experiments done on comets, cometary materials, on meteorites, which are residues of comets. And the evidence for these containing living forms is just absolutely crushing. It's just coming to the fore now. People are looking at it and they're turning their eyes away because it's too embarrassing. And so that's what's happening. But the truth cannot be avoided. I think this is true. This is a statement that was made by Gandhi. The truth is there and you cannot avoid it. Whether you like it or not, it is the truth. So that's where we stand with the comets.
You know, what is the role that viruses play or have played in the evolution of life on Earth?
Well, it used to be thought that viruses were just a nuisance, that they were parasitic entities, they were disease-causing little bits and pieces, and at best they were pickpockets. They took bits of genes from one animal and transplanted into another animal. But all that has changed after the year 2000, when the human genome was fully sequenced. The whole of this, our DNA was sequenced, right? We now know the full length of DNA. You can, even for medical purposes, you can get your DNA sequenced. And the DNA of our primates, like the monkeys and the great apes and so on, have been sequenced. Even the DNA of insects, like butterflies, have been sequenced. So what's transpired in the last 2 decades was that these genomes, our DNA, are replete with viral entities, bits of viruses. Viruses that affected our ancestors and our predecessors over millions of years. Maybe they caused pandemics, maybe they caused epidemics, maybe they culled most of the population, but the surviving population that went forward carried bits of these viruses in our genome. So something like 30% of our DNA is supposed to be derived from viruses, 30%, and that's a lot of viruses. So viruses have, I think, if you ask the question, what have they done to us? I think they are the vectors, the components of evolution. If not for viruses, the simplest organisms on Earth may not have evolved beyond the stage of maybe amoeba, or even less than that. So we are wholly dependent on viruses, I think, for Darwinian evolution to take place. It takes place against the backdrop of new body plans, new bits of information coming in the form of viruses.
So now your theory about viruses actually coming from space, and that's what causes the pandemic.
Well, I think that was a theory that began to take shape in 1976 or thereabouts, when there was a huge, not quite a pandemic, but it was called a red flu. I think it was a pandemic. It was a worldwide epidemic of influenza, a new brand of influenza that was not known on the earth for something like 20 or 30 years. And that meant that if it's a new brand of flu, it means that the children who were less than in school age, 13, 14, would not have encountered that virus in their lives, right? So they were they had no immunity to it. So what Fred Hoyle and I decided to do was to use this 1976 pandemic as an experiment to see whether the virus is actually being transmitted readily from one person to another, or whether there were pockets that were deposited in different places. And so we did this with a great deal of sort of assiduity and detail, focus on detail. And what we found was that although there was person-to-person spread to a limited extent, there was a patchy incidence of this new flu that was really very hard to explain in terms of a homegrown person-to-person infection only. So this was in 1976. Then we looked at the history of pandemics. Pandemics have been a problem that has been affecting civilizations from the ancient Babylonians to the ancient Greeks and all the way to modern times. There was a very famous epidemic in Athens in 436 BC called the Plague of Athens, right? It's a disease that has not been fully understood. It suddenly appeared and the whole of Athens went down with it, people died and so on. And the historian Thucydides, who wrote a lot about the history of Athens, was himself a victim of it, and he survived, and he's written about this. So that happened in Athens. Then there were lots of plagues, like the plague of Justinian in early Christendom. And most recently, the plague that we really looked at in great detail was an influenza outbreak in 1918, 1919. And we studied this in really great detail through all the literature, all the newspaper accounts and so on. And the evidence was really powerful for it being deposited from the sky. For example, the lethal so-called second wave of the 1918-1919 pandemic happened on the same day in Boston and Bombay. Boston in the United States and Bombay. And in those days there was no air travel, there was no airplanes. So for human beings to travel across from India to the United States would have taken months. So there's no way in which that would have happened. So it just fell from the skies. It was a stratospheric deposit that happened in two different places at the same time. And again, we looked at the details of the effect of this same pandemic, the 1918-19 pandemic, on very isolated communities in Alaska, where travel was very difficult from cities to the remote Alaskan icelands. And again, the same story, right? In very isolated regions, you get a sudden outbreak of this happening, right? So, I mean, that takes us forward to the corona virus pandemic that we all suffered for 3 or 4 years now. And the story there is that it was a mutation of an animal virus from a bat through to a pangolin, and maybe an intermediate animal beyond that as well, and finally to humans. And when we look at the probabilities of those mutations taking place, right, it's just incredibly small. I mean, you can just forget about it. It could happen once in the lifetime of the galaxy or something. No, that's totally bogus, and that's not the way it could have happened. I think the virus was not in any way related to these animal viruses. It was a virus that was separate, although very similar to some animal viruses, right? And it fell from the skies. And having fallen from the skies for the first time, maybe in Italy, maybe in China, roughly at the same time, then, of course, it spreads through person-to-person infection. And that's why we have to wear masks and stuff like that and isolate. But that's not the whole story. If you look at what's happened in the coronavirus pandemic, and my colleagues and I have looked at this very carefully, there are clear instances when ships at sea that were isolated for weeks with no contact with humans on land, suddenly the whole ship goes down with the coronavirus, right? So how does this happen? I mean, and after these testing kits and so on were available, they had all tested negative before they went. And so there was evidently no virus being carried. And then 3 weeks, 4 weeks on, there's a sudden pandemic. So they're looking at the provisions, bananas, apples, could they have brought? I think they're just struggling to find evidence for maintaining an ailing theory of life in the universe. And the coronavirus is just one of these aspects of it. It's not a trivial aspect because it's affected the world in a very profoundly important way economically, but that's where we stand.
So, Professor Wickramasinghe, in your studies of meteorites, what is the outcome of your studies when it came to the polar narrow meteorite which fell in 2012? Yeah,
let me just briefly tell you what meteorites are in terms of their genesis and their content. Meteorites are extinct comets that have gone round and round the sun, and all of the volatile ices, the organics, the liquids have evaporated, and you get a lump of carbonaceous material, right? These are the carbonaceous meteorites. So, and the polar narrow meteorite that fell in 2013 was such a carbonaceous meteorite. Now, it is not dissimilar, the polar narrow meteorite, not dissimilar to other meteorites of a similar type, carbonaceous meteorites that fell in France and all sorts of other countries in the world, Australia, over the past century. From the 1960s onwards, there's been a vigorous dispute as to whether these meteorites, the carbonaceous meteorites, contain fossilized microorganisms. The 1960s showed scientists fighting ferociously to defend their discoveries of structures within the meteorites that they thought were just fossilized bacteria and even viruses. That was argued and vigorously disputed, as I said. But in 1984, there was a German meteoritic scientist, German paleontologist, a man called Hans D. Flug, who used the most up-to-date techniques available to study meteorites, carbonaceous meteorites, and he found unequivocal evidence for microbial fossils within them. They were built into, they were sort of embedded in the rock, that they couldn't be contaminated. It couldn't have crawled in after the meteorite fell on the Earth. But still, it was sort of sidelined in discussions, and nobody wanted to enter into any discussion. Then in the Polonnaruwa meteorite, we had a really fantastic opportunity to study a meteorite that had just fallen. And we were in Sri Lanka at the time, and we heard about this, and we rushed to the site and collected samples and took them back and so on. And the story is that a poor farmer, a man called Tikiribanda, the previous evening he was sowing his paddy field, and then he suddenly saw what he called kalamadariya, fireflies in the sky. And he was really scared, so he rushed into his house and locked himself up. And the following morning, when he came to water his newly planted plants or crops, he found these funny things all over, little lumps of rock. Didn't look anything that he could recognize. So he quickly telephoned the Medical Research Institute, and that's the beginning of our story in terms of collection. So we had samples of this. We studied them in various labs in the US, in Japan, and so on, in England. And we found evidence of microbial fossils, no question about it. And particularly the fossil of a microorganism that was extinct on the Earth for 3.5 billion years. So how can that crawl into a rock that fell in Aralagangvilla, Polonnaruwa? Impossible. But still there's a distance being kept by the scientific meteoritic establishment in the US. One of the reasons given for this is that there is no video recording of the fall, right? This poor subsistence farmer is supposed to have had a smartphone and put it up to the sky and recorded the fall, and since there's no such recording, there's a resistance to accepting that this was a meteorite fall. But we have independent evidence. My colleague from the United States, Professor Richard Hoover, has recently completed a study of the Polonnaruwa meteorite, and he says that this meteorite has been in space for longer than the Earth has existed, for longer than 4.5 billion years. Because you can date, you can have a radioactive exposure age for these rocks, right? So they have been in space for longer than the Earth has been a planet. So I think there's absolutely no question that this evidence is crushing, absolutely crushing. But there's still a resistance, which I think is largely cultural.
So from 2001, you've been doing some research and some work on the stratosphere and looking for evidence of microorganisms in the stratosphere. How far have you come?
Well, I think the expectation was that if comets are throwing out this stuff, and I told you that my brother was already in 1986 finding microbial signatures in the dust streams that came out of Comet Halley. So these streams of particles from comets sometimes do enter the Earth's atmosphere, enter the Earth's environment. They enter first the stratosphere, and they get locked into the stratosphere for a while, and they get carried down to the Earth eventually. So in 2001, it occurred to us that we should really be sending balloons or rockets up to 50 kilometers, between 40 and 50 kilometers, and collecting this stuff before it gets contaminated with Earth stuff, right? So that's the important thing, to collect it in the sky, very high in the stratosphere. We did that, and we found enormous quantities, estimates of hundreds of tons of this stuff falling over the Earth which were biological entities, no question about it. We identified viable organisms with various techniques and so on, and some new organisms that the Indians, one named after Hoyle, one named after the Indian Space Research Organization. So there have been some new organisms discovered. And I think that project has to continue. We have it now happening. I hope it's going to happen in Sri Lanka as well, because I have a collaboration with the National Institute of Fundamental Studies, and they were going to launch a balloon to 41 kilometers, do a similar collection. They're going to do this for the last year, but the pandemic and now the economic problems have held them back. So I think more and more of this kind of experiment should be done, and they certainly could be done, and I think they ought to be done in order to essentially find our place in the cosmos. Without any argument, we should be able to establish beyond the shadow of doubt that life is everywhere, and that life on Earth is a small component of a much bigger living system.
So the search for extraterrestrial intelligence has been going on for over 6 decades now. Why do you think we just don't have any definitive evidence?
Well, I think the first part of the question is that the searches have been intermittent. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence was, first of all, in the 1960s, supported with great force and vigor by the American space agencies, and then they sort of, after finding negative results, they've sort of lost interest and so on. And now it's being continued with funds from millionaires and billionaires. But what they're doing is to use radio telescopes, right? Looking for radio signals that these alien civilizations might have sent out, that we can pick up and recognize as alien and recognize as intelligent. Now, that has happened for, as we said, for nearly 6 decades with no positive result. There's been one, of course, there's what's it called, the wow signal. There's one signal that was reported to be the wow signal, where an astronomer I think it's somewhere in the United States, suddenly discovered that there was a significant bleeping of a source that was not explicable in terms of natural phenomena. But it lasted for such a short time, and they couldn't repeat it, so that disappeared essentially. But I think we are probably looking for the wrong places. What if our alien civilizations, or superhuman maybe civilizations, have different ways of announcing their presence? That is a distinct possibility. Now, we talked about viruses earlier, and we talked about these silent bits of DNA and in the viruses. What if in the bacteria that we are picking up from the stratosphere, there are little bits of messaging in the silent DNA, right? That is possible. We can embed a coded message in the DNA of a bacterium, or bacterium certainly, and just throw it out in space, make vast quantities of this message and throw it out into space. And what then is required for us is to try to decode that message, right? And see whether there is an intelligent message recorded. My colleague in the University of London, Predrag, and I have written papers saying microbial SETI might be the answer to SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Look for signals in the microorganisms that are thousands of microbes settling on the Earth per day per square meter. That's the estimate we have. Over 1,000 per square meter per day, falling on the ground, going unnoticed because they just get mixed up with the biosphere, right? The microbial content in our bodies is also fantastic. We know that there's a microbiome in each of us, right? And the number of microbial cells in our guts and our skins and so on exceeds the body cells by a large, very, very large factor. So microbes are everywhere, and we have by no means charted the entire range of microbes that are in our midst. And amongst those microbes, I think we should really look for alien messaging. And that may be a sort of tall order, but I think
So do you think human intelligence is sort of the supreme or the pinnacle of biological intelligence?
I find that very, very hard to believe. I think that's a very anthropocentric, human-centered, arrogant point of view. I cannot believe that the so-called experiment of intelligence has to any extent reached the pinnacle in humans. I think there's going to be much greater levels of intelligence, and even microbial intelligence might be at a greater level, could be at a greater level than human intelligence. And that's not a very nice thing for us to contemplate, but I think we've got to keep all the options open.
How do you see society? How do you see the future of science maybe in the next 10 years, maybe in the next 100 years?
I think the first important thing that should happen is that we should accept wholeheartedly, without any bias and without any prejudice, our cosmic origins. We are creatures of the cosmos. There's no question about it. Every bit of evidence that I have studied, my colleagues have studied over the last 40 years point to that. And there is, in a large fraction of my colleagues, a grudging acceptance of that possibility. But very few come out in the open and say that we are creatures of the cosmos. So that has to happen. I think once that happens, once we acknowledge that we have a connection with a much bigger sort of cosmic living entity. I mean, it may be the sort of personification of God. We could use any terminology, we could use any analogies, but to regard ourselves as being the supreme intelligence is an error. I think that is an error that would lead us down the chute in the long term. And it's an error that is also causing enormous societal problems now. We see the wars in the Ukraine, wars between Ukraine and Russia and so on. Imperial conflict. It's a conflict between empires. There's an empire of the West and there's an empire of the East. And these are essentially irreconcilable unless we regard all life on Earth as being part of a single cosmic unity.
Well, that is a nice thought to remember, what you just said, that we are all creatures of the cosmos. Thank you so much for this amazing discussion we had. I mean, it ranged from viruses to meteorites to comets to extraterrestrial intelligence and everything in between. Your theories certainly hold a lot of water, and good luck with everything that you're doing right now. And I do hope whatever we are expecting to see out there, and we will be open in those expectations.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's nice talking to you.